You are going to the bathroom today, probably 6 times. You have a toilet that costs $300, toilet paper that comes in 48-roll bulk packs from a warehouse store, a door that locks, a phone to scroll while you wait, possibly a candle, possibly a white noise machine so nobody hears you, and a deeply held social understanding that this activity is private, shameful, and never to be discussed. Your prehistoric ancestor had none of that. No toilet, no paper, no door, no phone, no concept, none, zero, not even the beginning of one, that any of this required privacy. And their gut health was dramatically, measurably, scientifically better than yours. Not slightly better, not marginally better. Better in ways that modern researchers are only now beginning to fully understand. And worse in ways that are directly connected to the choices we made when we decided to build walls around this particular human activity. That is not an opinion. That is what the data says. And by the end of this video, you are going to look at your bathroom differently. You are going to look at your probiotic supplement differently. You might even look at your squatty potty differently. And if you do not own one yet, you will understand by the end of this video exactly why 3 gastroenterologists you have never met wish you did. If that already sounds like too much information, and also somehow not enough, subscribe now. Because this is the video nobody wanted to make and everybody needed to watch. And it gets significantly weirder before it gets better. Let us begin with something your doctor should have told you and almost certainly did not. The toilet is anatomically wrong. Not metaphorically wrong. Not philosophically wrong. Mechanically, structurally, biologically wrong for the human body, in a way that is both obvious in retrospect and almost completely ignored by the medical establishment for the better part of a century. Here is the problem. Your colon, the final section of your large intestine, responsible for completing the digestive process and moving waste toward the exit, is not a straight pipe. It has a natural bend near the end, called the anorectal angle. When you are standing or sitting upright at approximately 90 degrees, which is exactly the position a standard toilet seat puts you in, that angle remains partially closed. The puborectalis muscle, which wraps around the rectum like a sling, stays contracted. The exit is not fully open. You are, in engineering terms, trying to drain a tank through a partially kinked hose. When you squat, knees above hips, weight distributed through the feet, the puborectalis muscle relaxes completely. The anorectal angle straightens. The hose is no longer kinked. The process becomes faster, more complete, and requires significantly less straining. This is not folk medicine. This is not the opinion of someone trying to sell you something made of bamboo. A 2003 study published in Digestive Diseases and Sciences measured the anorectal angle in participants using 3 different positions: sitting, sitting with feet elevated, and squatting, and confirmed that the squatting position produces the most favorable geometry for defecation by a significant margin. A follow-up study in 2010 found that participants who squatted completed the process in an average of 51 seconds. Participants sitting on a standard toilet took an average of 114 seconds, more than twice as long, and required more effort to achieve a less complete result. Straining during defecation, which a poorly designed toilet seat encourages, is significantly associated with hemorrhoids, diverticular disease, and increased cardiovascular stress. People have had heart attacks on the toilet. This is a documented medical phenomenon. It is called defecation syncope. Your prehistoric ancestor did not have defecation syncope. They squatted, they completed the process in under a minute. They stood up, and they got on with the serious business of not getting eaten by something large. The squatty potty, that small plastic stool you have definitely seen advertised somewhere, exists entirely because a product designer looked at a toilet, looked at human anatomy, looked at 10,000 years of evidence, and concluded that we had been doing this wrong since the invention of indoor plumbing. Prehistoric humans did not need a squatty potty. They were just correct from the beginning. We designed around them, and then we designed a workaround for the design, and then we sold the workaround for $25 on Amazon. That is modern progress. Now, where exactly did they go? This is where the archaeology gets surprisingly specific, because the answer is not simply anywhere. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Agta of the Philippines, populations whose daily life patterns most closely resemble those of our prehistoric ancestors, consistently document the same behavioral pattern. Away from camp, downwind from camp, never within a certain distance of water sources, never near food preparation areas or food storage. This was not a law. There was no elder standing at the edge of camp with a clipboard explaining contamination vectors. But the behavior was consistent enough, across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, that researchers treat it as essentially a universal human behavioral default. Your ancestors had no germ theory. They did not know what bacteria were. They had never heard of the fecal-oral transmission route, which is the mechanism by which contaminated human waste spreads diseases like cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and polio. But they figured out the correct answer anyway, because what they did have was observation. When the camp stayed clean, people stayed healthy. When it did not, people died. You do not need a textbook to learn that lesson. You need about one bad season and a sufficient sample size. The same empirical logic that told them ash had antiseptic properties and clay could clean skin also told them that human waste belonged away from the water supply. They arrived at the right conclusion through the oldest form of research methodology that exists. They tried things. They noticed what happened. They changed what they did accordingly. This is, for the record, exactly the scientific method, just without the grant application. Here is the question everyone has been thinking about since the first 30 seconds of this video. What did they use instead of toilet paper? The honest answer is many things, depending on where they lived and what the landscape offered. And the more interesting answer is, whatever they used, it was in most cases more effective than what you are using. Let us go through the options. Leaves were the most common and most universal. Large, smooth, non-irritating leaves. The specific varieties differed by region, but the principle was consistent. The keyword smooth. Archaeological and anthropological records suggest that the selection of appropriate leaves for this purpose was a learned skill, passed down through communities. You learned which leaves worked. You learned which leaves made things significantly worse. This was practical knowledge. Water was extremely common, especially in warmer climates and regions near rivers or streams. Rinsing with water is, by every objective measure, more hygienic than wiping with paper. It removes the material rather than smearing it. It requires less surface contact. It leaves less residue. The modern bidet, which France, Italy, Japan, and most of the non-Anglophone world never stopped using, is functionally a mechanized version of what prehistoric humans were doing, with a cupped hand and a nearby water source. The great toilet paper shortage of 2020, which caused genuine panic across the United States and the United Kingdom, was baffling to most of the rest of the world, because most of the rest of the world uses water, and has for most of recorded history. Smooth stones are documented in archaeological contexts across Europe and the Middle East. Archaeologists have found rounded pebbles in what are clearly latrine contexts at multiple ancient sites, positioned in ways that are inconsistent with any other explanation. These are classified in the archaeological literature as anal cleansing stones. That is their official name. They appear in site reports with the same clinical precision as pottery shards and flint tools. Anal cleansing stones. You are welcome. Moss, grass, and snow were documented in cold climates. All three have practical advantages. Moss in particular is soft, absorbent, and has mild antimicrobial properties due to its natural phenolic compounds. Vikings used moss. This is documented. The Vikings, who navigated across the North Atlantic by the stars, who founded settlements in Greenland, and reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, who developed complex legal systems and trade networks. Those Vikings used moss. And they were fine. Now let us jump forward. Because the story of how humans handled this does not stay in the prehistoric period. It moves through civilizations. And what those civilizations did is simultaneously impressive, baffling, and in at least one case, genuinely charming. Rome. The Roman Empire at its height operated the most sophisticated sanitation infrastructure the ancient world had ever seen. Aqueducts brought fresh water into cities. Underground sewers, the Cloaca Maxima in Rome itself, begun in the 6th century BCE and still partially functional today, removed waste from population centers on a scale that would not be matched again for nearly 2,000 years. And the Romans built public latrines, Foricae, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes cut into them, positioned over a channel of flowing water that continuously carried waste away. Multiple seats, side by side, no partitions, no privacy. People sat next to each other, conducted conversations, conducted business, occasionally exchanged social invitations. The Roman public latrine was a social space. Archaeologists excavating latrine sites across the former Roman Empire have found evidence of organized conversation, of graffiti on the walls, of offerings left for Fortuna, the goddess of luck, whose protection in the latrine was apparently considered prudent given the practical risks involved. There was also a shared implement, called the Xylospongium, a sponge on a stick, kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar, shared communally among latrine users. You used it. The next person used it, you used it again. This practice is documented in multiple ancient sources, including the writings of Seneca, who mentions it almost in passing as an entirely unremarkable feature of daily Roman life. The shared sponge was not considered unsanitary. It was considered efficient. There was running water. The sponge was rinsed. That was the system. By our current standards, this is appalling. by the standards of a civilization that had effectively eliminated cholera from its major cities through engineering while the rest of the ancient world was dying of it. This was advanced. Context matters enormously when judging the past. Drop a comment right now. Roman communal latrine with the shared sponge, or prehistoric open field with a smooth stone. Which one are you surviving? I genuinely need to know. The comment section on this question is going to be extraordinary. Rome was not alone in developing sophisticated approaches to this most fundamental of human needs. Every major civilization that achieved sufficient population density to make sanitation a genuine public health question arrived at solutions. They just arrived at very different ones. China. The Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, developed a paper-based approach that predates the Western world's adoption of paper for this purpose by approximately 1,000 years. Paper was invented in China, and the Chinese figured out fairly quickly that it had practical applications beyond documentation. The first written reference to paper being used for personal hygiene appears in Chinese texts from the 6th century CE. By the Tang Dynasty, 600 to 900 CE, paper was being produced specifically for hygiene purposes in large quantities. An Arab traveler named Ibn Battuta, visiting China in the 14th century, noted with some surprise that the Chinese cleaned themselves with paper rather than water, which he considered inferior and recorded with mild disapproval. Different civilizations. Different conclusions about the same problem. India. The Indian subcontinent developed what may be the world's first urban sanitation systems in the cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, dating to approximately 2500 BCE. Archaeologists excavating these sites in the 1920s and 30s discovered something that stopped them cold: indoor bathrooms. Private rooms with brick-lined toilet seats, connected to covered drains that ran beneath the streets and emptied into municipal sewage channels. The Indus Valley Civilization had indoor plumbing 4,500 years ago. They solved this problem before Egypt built the pyramids, and then the civilization collapsed for reasons still debated, and the knowledge went with it. The Ottoman Empire. The hammam, the Ottoman public bathhouse, was one of the most sophisticated hygiene institutions ever devised. These were not simply bathing facilities. They were sequenced environments designed to move the body through a specific process: undressing, sweating in a hot room, receiving a systematic scrub, rinsing, cooling, dressing. Every Ottoman city of any size had multiple hammams. They were public, accessible, and considered a fundamental civic institution. The Ottoman approach to personal hygiene, including the use of specific water vessels called ibriks for post-toilet cleansing, was documented by European travelers throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, consistently with a mixture of admiration and the specific anxiety of someone who has just realized another culture has been doing something better than you for several centuries. Medieval Europe. Let us just say it plainly. Medieval Europe was, by the standards of Rome, the Indus Valley, China, and the Ottoman Empire, not doing well in this particular area. The chamber pot. A ceramic vessel kept in the bedroom, used at night, and disposed of in the morning by the method most immediately available, which was the window. You threw it into the street, every morning, across Europe. From the medieval period through the early modern period, the standard method for disposing of household waste in European cities was to open a window and throw. There was a specific etiquette around this. You were supposed to call out a warning first. In French, gardez l'eau, watch out for the water. The English borrowed the phrase, shortened it, and that is where the word loo comes from. One of the most fundamental words in the English language for bathroom is a phonetic corruption of a French warning about incoming waste falling from above. The streets of medieval European cities were, by modern standards, catastrophic. Samuel Pepys, the 17th century English diarist who documented daily London life with remarkable candor, wrote in 1660 that he stepped into his cellar one morning and found it full of his neighbor's waste, which had seeped through the wall. His response was to go to the tavern, which tracks. It was not until the 19th century, when cities had grown large enough that the consequences of poor sanitation became impossible to ignore, that Europe rebuilt its relationship with this problem. The Great Stink of London in 1858, when the River Thames became so contaminated that Parliament was forced to suspend sessions due to the smell, finally produced the political will to build a modern sewer system. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed and built 1,300 miles of underground sewers beneath London in the 1860s. It eliminated cholera from the city within a decade. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives. It is one of the greatest feats of civil engineering in human history. And it exists because, for several centuries, the most powerful empire on Earth could not figure out a better system than throwing it out the window. Now here is where everything changes. Because we have been talking about method, about infrastructure, about the long, strange, occasionally appalling history of how humans managed this fundamental biological process. But the real story, the one that should actually keep you up at night, is what was happening inside your gut microbiome. The community of bacteria, fungi, parasites, and other microorganisms living in your digestive tract right now is, by every measurable standard, less diverse than your prehistoric ancestors. Significantly less diverse. A landmark study comparing the gut microbiomes of the Hadza people of Tanzania, whose hunter-gatherer lifestyle most closely resembles ancestral patterns, to those of industrialized Western populations, found that Hadza adults carry approximately 40% more microbial diversity than the average American or European. 40%. And the Hadza microbiome includes dozens of bacterial species that are essentially absent from Western guts entirely. Not rare. Absent. These are organisms that lived in human guts for hundreds of thousands of years. They shaped the development of our immune systems. They produced compounds our bodies incorporated into their normal functioning. And they are gone. A separate study tracking the Hadza microbiome across seasons found something even more striking. Their gut microbiome changes dramatically between wet season and dry season. Different plants available, different diet, different microbial exposure. The diversity fluctuates. It adapts. The Western gut microbiome does not do this. It is static, narrow, a reduced version of what it was designed to be, maintained on a diet of approximately 30 plant species, stripped by antibiotics, sanitized by chlorinated water, and isolated from the soil and environmental microorganisms that spent millions of years shaping it. Your gut is not sick in the conventional sense. It is impoverished. It has less to work with than it evolved to have, and the consequences are everywhere. Irritable bowel syndrome affects an estimated 10 to 15% of the global population and disproportionately affects industrialized countries. Inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis has increased dramatically in industrialized nations over the past 50 years, while remaining rare in populations maintaining more traditional lifestyles. The gut-brain axis, the direct communication pathway between your gut microbiome and your brain via the vagus nerve, means that a less diverse gut microbiome is not just a digestive problem. It is a neurological one. Approximately 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut, not in the brain. In the gut, by the microorganisms living there. The organisms that shaped your ancestors' mood, sleep, stress response, and cognitive function for 200,000 years are increasingly absent from the gut of the average person reading this right now. This is a new problem. It is dressed up as a very old one. So why was their gut microbiome more diverse? 3 reasons. The first is diet. Hadza adults consume somewhere between 100 and 150 different plant species per year. The average person in an industrialized country consumes approximately 30. Gut microbial diversity is directly driven by dietary diversity. Different microorganisms consume different substrates. If you only eat 30 plant species, you can only sustain the organisms that consume those 30 things. The rest starve out gradually. Your ancestors ate everything the landscape offered, across every season, from every environment they passed through. Their gut was a rainforest. Yours is a managed lawn. The second reason is environmental exposure. Every time a prehistoric human squatted outside, every time they touched soil, every time they ate food that had come directly from the earth, they were delivering environmental microorganisms directly into their gut. This was not a health risk, it was a health requirement. The organisms that arrived through food and soil and direct environmental contact were not all harmful. Many of them were signals the gut immune system was calibrated to receive. The old friends hypothesis, which we discussed in the last video, applies with particular force to the gut. The data showing that early childhood exposure to diverse soil microorganisms reduces lifetime risk of allergies, asthma, and inflammatory conditions is now sufficiently robust that pediatric researchers are actively reconsidering guidance about childhood exposure to dirt. The recommendation, "do not let your child eat dirt," may be one of the most well-intentioned pieces of advice that ever backfired at a population scale. The third reason is the absence of antibiotics. The average person in an industrialized country takes a course of antibiotics approximately once every 2 years across their lifetime. Each course eliminates not just the target pathogen, but significant portions of the beneficial gut microbiome. Recovery takes months. It is often not complete. The microbiome that comes back is not identical to the one that was disrupted. It is a reconstructed version, a less diverse version, a version missing organisms that the previous version contained. Your prehistoric ancestor never took an antibiotic. Their gut community was ancient, continuous, and self-sustaining, in a way that yours is not and cannot be under current conditions. This is not a reason to stop taking antibiotics when you need them. Antibiotics save lives. That is not in dispute. But it is a reason to understand that every course of antibiotics is a trade-off, and that the cumulative cost of that trade-off, across a lifetime, across a population, is something we are still calculating. Your prehistoric ancestors went to the bathroom in a squat, with no paper, no privacy, no door, and no anxiety about any of it whatsoever. The Romans sat next to each other and discussed business. The Indus Valley had indoor plumbing 4,500 years ago and then lost it. Medieval Europe threw it out the window every morning and called the warning gardez low, and somehow built an empire in between. And through all of it, through the stones and the leaves and the shared sponges and the chamber pots, the human gut was doing something modern science is only now beginning to appreciate. It was staying connected to the soil, to the environment, to the ancient organisms it had spent millions of years expecting to encounter. We solved the contamination problem. We eliminated cholera. We built infrastructure that has saved more lives than any other public health intervention in history. And in doing so, we also built walls, literal and biological, between the human gut and the ecosystem it co-evolved with. The probiotic industry is worth more than $60 billion globally. It exists entirely because we removed something and are now trying to sell it back. Your ancestors did not need probiotics. They were living inside one. If this changed how you think about something you do 6 times a day, the like button is right there. It actually helps more than you think. Next video, we are going back even further, to before cooking existed, to the moment when early humans first put food in fire, and what that single act did to the human brain is one of the most contested and fascinating debates in all of evolutionary biology. The cooking hypothesis. It drops next week. Subscribe so you do not miss it.